Computer. Okay, we are live Wednesday night, recording and ready to learn some parasha. As I mentioned, I am muting people as you settle in, and that's so that I can hear myself think and we can start the class. But as I said last week, and I mean it, don't let me muting you make you feel like you shouldn't participate in this class. And if you have a thought, if you have a perspective, if you have a question, I want you to jump in. One of the benefits of being over Zoom is that we really can participate in our learning together and almost make this feel, I think, like a Beit Midrash of sorts, a Beit Midrash, a traditional house of Jewish learning, though it is a virtual house of Jewish learning, and in that way, a little less traditional still. So let me go ahead and mute everyone, just because I know a lot of people are still settling in. And we'll jump right into the Parsha. And as I said, don't be shy. If you have a point, you can raise either your real hand and I'll try to catch it, or go into reactions and give a thumbs up or something that way, and I'll try to catch you there as well. Okay, so all that having been said, we're ready to jump in. Where did we leave off last week? For those who remember, we had been studying the conflict between Jacob, our third patriarch, and his brother Esav. They were born into conflict. From the very moment of conception, they were fighting with each other. Barbara, go ahead and mute. I'm trying to mute you. Got it. Okay, great. Born into conflict. From the womb, they were fighting. Yaakov, Jacob, in Hebrew literally means heel, because Jacob was born grabbing onto Esav's heel. He wanted to be the first one out, and Esav was. And so through their life, they had this conflict over who should receive the blessing from their father, who should receive the birthright. And it came to a climax last week, if you remember, the moment in which they were about to reconcile. And we didn't see it in the Torah. We didn't get to it. But in fact, those who know the story know there was a beautiful moment of forgiveness and reconciliation. The two brothers come together. They embrace. The Torah says that they kiss. And if only for that moment, there is a bit of forgiveness. Now, I do want to share with you one point that I didn't bring up last week. There are dots above the letter, above the word Vayishkehu, and they kissed in the Torah. Mysterious dots over that word. And it leads our rabbis to say in one comment, not that the brothers made up and that they kissed, but in fact, that Esav used that as an opportunity to bite Jacob's neck. Like a vampire, almost. As a way of saying that according to some rabbis, it was not that moment of forgiveness and reconciliation that we would have hoped for. In fact, Esav was the same old Esav who had that violent and aggressive tendency. And at least according to that perspective, there was still an issue present that they didn't really make up. Although it's not my interpretation. I certainly prefer the happy ending. I like the Disney ending, thinking of Jacob and Esav having that moment of reconciliation. But you understand where the rabbis would get that, because in their minds, Esav came to represent not the non-Jewish world, but more particularly the anti-Semitism within the non-Jewish world. And so as they looked at the world around them and saw the violence that had come about and the violence that was directed at themselves, it led them to interpret the story in that way. All that by way of background to lead us into this week. So let me go into screen share, because we come now this week to a new chapter in the story. Jacob has aged. Jacob is nearing the end of his life. Can everyone see the text for this week? Okay, great. And he's had this life that, as I just mentioned, was filled with conflict. filled with tumult, filled with tsuris. He had problem after problem, not only with his brother, but we know also the time that he spent with Lavan was very challenging. He wrestled with the angel, as we saw last week. Lots of issues. And when we come to this week's reading, the chapter in which Jacob is nearing the end of his life, we would imagine that Jacob would want a break. This is the beginning of a section that I like to think of as Jacob's retirement. After so much stress and so much tumult, he just wants to be able to relax, to feel a little bit of that peace and that contentment that we're all, I think, entitled to. And that's why the name of this Torah portion is Vayeshev. Vayeshev. The very first word of the reading this week, Vayeshev Yaakov. Jacob settled. What does it mean that he settled? Perhaps that he was able to rest just a little bit, to take a break, to enjoy his old age and not have any more conflict, not have any more tsuris. In fact, if you look closely at this Hebrew root, shin bet, what Hebrew word does this root relate to? It's something that we celebrate each and every week in our calendar as Jews. Any thoughts? Someone jump in? Jump in.
Shabbat.
Shabbat. Vayeshev literally means to settle or to sit, but on a deeper sense connected to Shabbat, as in Jacob was finally able to get some of that rest, some of that peace that we know we all crave at a certain point in life. In fact, we all are deserving of that throughout life, a break every now and then. Now, what's interesting, and it's kind of a tough commentary on life, is you look at the story that's going to come and you ask yourself, how long did Jacob get to rest for? How long did his retirement last? 1 minute, not more than a second. Because as we go into the story, you're going to see there's even more to worry about, more to have to deal with in life. And the idea, which I think is really pretty profound, is that as Jews, we never hold as the highest ideal in life just being completely settled, completely at peace, and completely removed from the drama of the world. In fact, it's upon us to be engaged with the world. And sometimes that's tough and sometimes it's painful, but that is what our spirituality is. Not going off on the mountain and meditating and finding peace, but being deeply engaged with the drama of the world. The blessing that we say over Torah is la'asok b'divrei Torah, to be engaged and to be deeply rooted in this world. So, any questions so far about the setup? Just the first verse. What Jacob wants is different from the reality. And by the way, you think about our own time today, how many of us would like just a moment to feel a little settled, to feel a little peace? We don't always get it when we want it. And that's something we have to work through. Here's verse 2. Now the drama. We're going to see what the issue actually is here. Ele toldot Yaakov. Everyone with me in the second verse? These are the generations of Jacob. Yosef. We are introduced to this figure named Joseph, who's going to be the main figure that we study for the next couple of weeks. Yosef ben Sheva Esre Shana. He's 17 years old. That should tell you something already. What do you know about a 17-year-olds? Well, hold on to it. We'll see. He's 17 years old. Haya ro'eh et echav betzon. He's working with his brothers as a shepherd in the field. Vehu na'ar. What is a na'ar? Na'ar just means youth. But it could be a little bit more. When the Torah calls him a na'ar, I think what the Torah is really saying, and Rashi says this too, he's a little immature. He might be past bar mitzvah age as a 17-year-old, but in certain ways, as we're going to see, Yosef acts like he hasn't had his bar mitzvah yet. He's a little immature, and we'll see where that comes from. He's na'ar, he's youthful, and he's a helper to the sons of his father's other wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. I'll remind you of the family tree. And what is Joseph busy doing all day? In the last line, we find out. Veyaveh Yosef et dibatam ra'ah. And Yosef is bringing negative reports el avihem, to their father. What is the main characterization of this man, of this young man up until now? What does he like to do all day? Someone call it out.
Make trouble.
Yeah. I was out with my brother's dad, Jacob, and guess what? This one was busy doing this, and this one said that, and he did this wrong thing, and he did that wrong thing. He's spending his energy gossiping, speaking ill of his brothers. And a big theme in this story, as we'll see as we get into it more deeply, is the power of words. Now, we all know in life how a single word of gossip, a single line of gossip can ruin a relationship. You say one thing about somebody that's harsh or untrue, that's gossip, and they find out, they'll hold it. It's very, very hard to make amends once that has been said. And we all know once the words leave our lips, they can't be taken back. There's that famous story of someone who gossips, goes to the rabbi and says, "What should I do about it?" The rabbi says, "I want you to take a pillow filled with feathers and open it up and let the feathers fly into the wind." And then he says, "How do you rectify the situation? Go and pick up every single feather," which is impossible. And that's what it's like. Once the words leave, we can't take them back. And all the more so today with everything on Zoom and everything recorded and everything on social media, it's out there. And so we have to be very careful. I think this story reminds us that everything, to the extent that we're able, that comes from our mouths, we can ask ourselves, does it pass through three gates? Is it true? Is it kind? And is it necessary? Is it true? Is it kind? And is it necessary? That's a pretty tall order, but try that. The next time you go to say something and you ask yourself, I'm not sure if this really needs to be said. Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? If it doesn't pass those three, maybe hold it back. But for whatever reason, we're getting into this story now, and we see Joseph is not taking that test. Everything he sees that's wrong with his brothers, that's the report he's bringing. And I just want to remind you, Judaism puts a lot of energy into speaking about words and the power of the words that we use. There are entire large books of Jewish law devoted to no subject other than what we call lashon hara, speech that is negative. Hundreds and hundreds of pages have been written about how to speak as a Jew. And we know, how was the world created according to the Torah? What created the world? What act? In the beginning, God said that words have the power to create a world, but they also have the power to destroy a world. And that's something we take to heart. So Yosef was immature. He's gossiping. He's sowing the seeds of the hatred that we're going to see his brothers have for him. Rashi adds another layer to this characterization of Yosef, saying not only is he immature, but look at how Rashi talks about Yosef. His actions were childish, Rashi says. What did he do? He was mitaken bisaro. He was always fixing his hair. We talked at the beginning before the class started about getting a haircut during COVID. Well, Yosef was always fixing his hair. He was memashmesh be'enav. He was touching up his eyes, doing his eyebrows. Kedei sheyeh nireh yafeh, so that he should look beautiful, that he should look good, appear good looking. What is it about Yosef that we learn from this characterization here, according to Rashi? What is he preoccupied with? Fixing his hair, touching his eyebrows, looking in the mirror constantly. What do we learn about him? Who is he thinking about all day?
No.
Thank you. Yosef, according to Rashi, adding on this extra layer, is self-centered, at least as a young man. He's concerned with his appearance. He can't pass a mirror by without staring at it for a couple minutes. He wants to look good. He is the center of his own world. He's the center of the universe. And by the way, the Torah said already he's 17 years old. What do we know about most 17-year-olds? They're kind of like that. They kind of think that they are the center of the universe. And, you know, Yosef, as we're going to see, was no exception. He might have grown up to be a tzaddik, a righteous person, one of the greatest figures in our entire Torah. But as a young man, he was a teenager like any other teenager, causing problems, gossiping, self-interested and self-absorbed. Should tell you also that you can grow up to be a tzaddik or become a tzaddik at a later stage of life and not necessarily be born that way. In fact, none of us is. It takes work. So that's Yosef up until now, gossiping, self-absorbed. And now we're going to add a little fuel onto the fire. We're going to add a little fuel. How can we make this situation more complicated and more dramatic and more problematic? Bring Jacob into the mix. And I'll show you the family tree where we see how the same challenges that plagued Jacob's early life, he brings to his own family life. And that's a question we're going to look at. But let's see the verse first. Everybody with me at verse 3 now? Vayisrael. Who is Yisrael?
His father.
Jacob. Another name for Jacob. Interesting why the Torah chooses that name to call him Yisrael here and not Jacob when it called him Jacob just one verse earlier. We'll have to hold on to that. But here's the problem. V'Yisrael ahav et Yosef mikol banav. That's big, folks. What does the word ahav mean?
Love.
And Yisrael, father Jacob, loved Joseph mikol banav. From all his children, he loved Joseph the most. A clear and explicit example of favoritism. You have a kid who's self-absorbed. You have a kid who's speaking negatively about his brothers. And you have a father who clearly favors that one. This is like recipe for, what is that show, Dr. Phil? This is how it starts. Ki ben zikunim hu, hulo, because Joseph was the child of his old age, Jacob's old age, I'll explain. Ve'asalo katonet pasim, and he made for him an ornamented tunic. Now, this is where the Torah gives us the idea that we know the famous Broadway show, right? Or is it off Broadway?
Broadway.
Right? The
amazing-
Technicolor dream coat, the beautiful multicolored coat that we saw on the stage. Well, it comes from this verse, Ketonet Pasim, which is tough to translate. It doesn't really mean necessarily a rainbow tunic. I think Broadway took a little license there with the way that they created it, but a tunic that is ornamented. That is to say, it's very beautiful. It has a nice design to it. So Yaakov has given Yosef this gift, this special gift, only to him and not to any of the other brothers. And it's clear that Yaakov loves Yosef the most. And that's going to be the stage that's set for the drama that ensues. Now, let me stop there for a second because I want to show you where some of this is coming from in the family tree. And then I want to ask a question. So, who's familiar with Jacob's family tree? We know of the wives that Jacob had, who was the favorite? Who was the one that Jacob really loved the most, according to the Torah?
Rachel.
Rachel. Very good.
Mhm.
And from Rachel, we get two children. One is Benjamin, one is Yosef. So we know already that Yosef is among the children from Jacob's favored wife. What about Benjamin? Here's where it gets to be a little emotionally charged and a little more complicated from an emotional point of view. Okay? What happened when Benjamin was born to Rachel? Does anyone know? This is a tough question
She
in terms of
died.
trivia.
She
Sheila?
died giving birth.
Good. When Benjamin was born, Rachel passed away. There was trouble in the birth. In fact, Benjamin's original name was Ben-Oni. Oni means suffering. That is to say, his name was child of my suffering or of my pain. So it could be that looking at Benjamin, Jacob is reminded of that pain and that struggle, and that's why Benjamin is not the favored. But Joseph, on the other hand, if Joseph is the only other child to come from Rachel, to come from the wife that he loved and lost, the wife that he loved the most and lost, it could be that his favoritism for Yosef is actually because he looks into Yosef's eyes and it reminds him of his wife that he loves so very much and misses so very much. And it could be that deeper emotional context that leads him to that favoritism, that it's not something that's malicious. He doesn't want to cause problems as a father, but this son, Yosef, is his one link to the wife that he misses. And for that reason, Yosef is favored. And it explains also some of the difference between Yosef and the other brothers. Because if Yosef's mother has passed away, we can understand why he might feel like kind of an outcast or an outsider compared to some of the other brothers. I wanted to show you that as a way of filling in a little bit more of the emotion behind this scene that we're seeing. It's not so simple to say that Jacob messed up by choosing favorites and that Yosef was vain and selfish and immature. There's more going on here. And there's more going on the emotional level that we can really only see when we know that backstory. Any thoughts about that context, about how those emotions might be driving what we're seeing here?
Of Joseph's behavior, not having a mother while everyone else has a mother, et cetera, et cetera. So he has to prove himself, perhaps to himself, if not others. But I'm disappointed a little bit in Jacob because making an ornamental coat is not a subtle way of showing favoritism.
Nice.
A pinch on the cheek, a hug, that's a little more subtle.
Right, a little hug. I'm thinking of you. I know your mother's no longer with us, but I just want you to know how much I love you. That's one thing. But to make a big display of a gift, That seems to be an issue. And it's more of an issue when you remember what was the drama that animated Jacob's entire life. What was the conflict that his entire life was based around?
Yep.
Leah and Rachel.
Favoritism. Who's the favored one? Who's the favored wife? And who's the favored son, him or Esav? All of the problems that he experienced in life were around the issue that comes up when a parent favors one child over another. And here he is doing the same thing, repeating that same mistake again. Another generation, same problem. Now, I always like to ask groups this question. You don't have to answer, but think about it. What is one thing that your parents did that all your life you said, I'll never do that. I will never do that no matter what. I'm never going to be someone who acts like that. And now you find yourself doing it. We all have one thing like that. And in this case, Jacob couldn't escape it. That somehow that question of the favoritism, which child is on the higher level, followed him. And it followed him to this point, to the point of his own children as well.
But Rabbi, he doesn't know any better. That's what he grew up with. So how should he know better? How should he know differently?
So that is one of the biggest questions, I think, in all of Jewish faith. The question of teshuvah. Are we free to always make another choice? And so often in life, we're conditioned to act a certain way based on our environment, based on the people who raise us, based on so many factors. But are we always free as Jews to look at that and to find a way to say, no, I know deep down there's a new way, a better way, a different way, and to do what we call teshuvah, literally turning around from that and starting anew. What did Abraham do? He grew up in an idolatrous environment. He said, that's not for me. And he started a new path. Why couldn't Jacob have done that? Why couldn't Jacob have looked at the past and said, I don't want that pain to be repeated. I want to chart a new course here.
Because
Hard to say. And we've all been in that place in our own lives where we find ourselves repeating the same mistakes again and again and again, and we're in a loop. How do you break out of it? That is one of the central questions that we grapple with. And Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, of course, those are our times for really examining it and saying, what habits in life, what character traits in life have been holding me down that I just haven't been able to break free from? How can I be free from them? So that's kind of a lot on that subject. Any other thoughts? Do you blame Jacob for his behavior? Do you understand where it's coming from? What do you think?
it's a disappointment for me, but I understand it. He has to do it because, and that's the only reason.
Now, what really surprises me, though, is the Torah's choice of the name Yisrael, because I thought that Yisrael was the name that was given to him when he had reached the higher level, when he was acting in the way that was befitting of a patriarch, when he was living up his fullest potential. Why is the Torah calling him Yisrael here in this moment that seems to be a big mistake? That's something to grapple with, I think, for all of us.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I believe that Yisrael denotes a struggle. He struggled with the angel.
Very nice.
And this is what we're reading about right now, is a struggle for Joseph to overcome natural tendencies and the influence of his mother too.
Very nice. And I mentioned it on Friday night. I mentioned it a lot last week when we saw the wrestling scene with the angel. But Ken, you're right there. Yisrael means the one who struggles.
Mhm.
And sometimes you struggle and you succeed, and other times you struggle and you don't succeed. And maybe the Torah is tipping us off to the fact that this was a moment of real internal struggle. Do I fall victim to the character that I've always been, or can I transcend that?
Mhm.
Okay. Shall we go on a little bit further? Let's go a little more. Rashi fills out some of the information by telling us two other facts: that Yosef was like Jacob in that Yosef was very wise. We know Jacob was someone who truly valued learning and wisdom, and Yosef too was a very wise young man. And also, Rashi tells us his facial features were similar. That Jacob looked at Yosef and saw a little bit of himself. And that through that, seeing a little bit of himself, he was a little more partial. That's where some of the favoritism comes as well. So let's see, we have some time left. Let's see now how the plot thickens. Everybody's still with me? We're awake? Need a sip of coffee, tea, whatever it is, do it. In the last half, I want to show you how the drama just multiplies. You thought that this was an episode of Dr. Phil waiting to happen, and now they're on the stage and they're really, really going to go for it. What happens? Vayiru echav ki oto ahav avihem mikol echav. And the brothers saw that he, meaning Jacob, loved him more than them. A repetition of the word ahav. We saw it in 2 verses in a row. They saw that he loved him more. They saw again and again this favoritism. And here's the contrast with this word right here. Vayisneu oto. And they hated him. The word soneh, hatred, is the opposite of ahav, love. You might have heard the phrase sinat chinam, baseless hatred, which we talk about in many different contexts. Sinah means hatred, a deep and true hatred. But between brothers, that's what the Torah is saying here. And it goes on. Velo yachlu dabro leshalom. They hated him so much that they were unable to speak with him leshalom, with any peace at all. That means to say, they hate him to the extent that they look at him and they can't even bring themselves to say a single word. He walks by them, they turn around and look the other way, or they look down. They can't even say, hi, how are you doing? They can't even pick up the phone and say, hi, I know it's Hanukkah. We hate each other, but I just want to wish you a happy Hanukkah, even though we disagree. The level of this hatred made it such that they were basically not in communication. They had completely alienated one another. And it's something to think about. I'm not going to get political here. Actually, maybe a little bit political, in the sense that what does it mean to hate someone or to hate what someone stands for so much that you cannot have even a 5-minute peaceful conversation with them?
Okay.
What does it mean to disagree to such an extent that if we're at a table, I can't even talk to you about the weather for 5 minutes? That's my sinah, that's my hatred for you. And in a sense, that's what we see here between brothers, but it's something to think about in our world as well. We know how divided our country currently is, and I don't want to get too deep into that, but something to think about. Can we disagree vehemently? can we hate what another person stands for? Hate, but still find a way to speak, if only for a moment, leshalom, with some eye toward peace and some eye toward being together. And you might say, no, it's impossible. You might say, there are people who we should disagree with so much, we shouldn't even speak to them. But I would ask, don't we know in Jewish tradition that one of our highest ideals is, in fact, being able to speak with those we disagree with and having some moment of productive conversation? It's a live question. And it comes out in the Torah in a very, very visceral way this week because they're brothers. They're literally brothers. And yet they can't speak. Thoughts? Maybe someone, speaking of speaking, someone who hasn't shared anything yet, who wants to jump in on this verse, and then if not, people who have been jumping in, that's good too. And then I have a point I want to make.
It's pretty sad in a way because their father didn't give them the brothers a chance to have a normal relationship, even to be like brothers can be, loving and caring. And
so you're
just like destroyed that for them.
You're putting this on Jacob mostly. He should have created an environment where they could speak peacefully.
Absolutely, because that's a parent's job. That's what's supposed to be. That's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah, remember, they're younger. Maybe it's the adult. Maybe it's the mature one in the room who's supposed to create a positive, healthy environment. Okay, I like that. I like that. Other thoughts? Is there anyone in this world who you would disagree with so much that you can't have a 5-minute peaceful conversation? Yeah, I see a hand.
Well, what disturbs me is, for a change, I see, thank God the father's being blamed. I see the fact that the brothers didn't like him, not so much because he was a favorite child, perhaps, but more that he was going back to Jacob and tattling on them what they did, excuse me, what they did bad. How did Jacob handle the information that Joseph gave him? And
Nice.
To me, that's would be more important than the favorite part. I mean, hopefully all our kids believe they're the favorite in some way anyway. But that he would go back and tell, what did Jacob do with that information? How did he handle it?
So bringing it back to the original issue of what Joseph did wrong, which was an issue of speech. So if Joseph made a mistake based in speech, then you can understand how the response from the brothers would be speech-based. You might think of it like this. If he's going to go tell our father everything we say, we're not going to say anything to him. If you know someone who's a gossip, they're going to twist all of your words and use them against you. You're not going to say two things to that person. And maybe the brothers in this case are actually kind of wise to not speak to Joseph. And another thing that didn't come out yet, Rashi highlights it, is that old saying, which we've all heard in nursery school, if you have nothing nice to say, don't say anything. That could be to the brother's credit. If they hate him, if they dislike him strongly, if they have nothing to say to him that would be positive, better for them to keep their mouths shut. Better for them to not add more fuel to this fire. Rashi says that. He says, from what is stated to their discredit, we may infer something to their credit. They did not speak one thing with their mouth, having another thing quite different in their hearts. They hated him, but they had the wisdom to not share that all day, to just keep it to themselves. Okay, let's go on a little bit further, because just when you thought it couldn't get any worse in this situation, and don't worry, for those who are on the edge of your seats, ultimately things end up great. The end of the Yosef narrative is beautiful. We're going to get there in 2 weeks, 3 weeks. We'll see it. But for now, we have the setup in the drama. Here's where it gets worse. Vayachalom Yosef chalom. And Joseph dreamed a dream. Okay. We know he'll come to be characterized as a dreamer in certain ways. He's a big picture thinker. V'yaged le'echav v'yosifu od sono oto. He had a dream which he told to his brothers, and it increased their hatred more. This is a play on words that I just want to share with you quickly. What does the name Yosef mean? What is the meaning of the name Yosef?
Add on.
Say again?
Add on.
To add. Lehosif in Hebrew is to add. Joseph, being one of the last children born to Jacob, was an add-on. And so his name became, this one's added on. But that concept follows him in life. He adds a lot to the world in terms of his wisdom, in terms of his intellect later on. But here, there's a play on words. Veyosifu od seno. What he's adding to here is not good. He's adding to the hatred. He's adding to the problems. It's interesting, you know, those who come on Shabbat morning, we have a service called the Musaf service. You've heard of that, right? What is Musaf? It's from the same Hebrew word as Yosef, to add on. It's the additional service, the added extra service. That's where we get this concept from. Here, he's adding on to the hatred, not the blessing. What's the content of the dream? We've heard it, but good to see it. Vayomer alehem shimuna. He says to his brothers, listen up. Listen to me. I have something I want to share. Ahalom hazeh asher chalamti. Listen to this dream that I just had. Not very mature. Going out and explaining this. Here's the dream. We were binding sheaves in the field when suddenly my sheaf stood up and remained upright. Then your sheaves gathered around and bowed low to my sheaves. And that's my dream. The end. Can you imagine a situation where there's favoritism, where there's hatred, where there's animosity, and this is what he thinks to tell them? What is he thinking here? Is he immature? Is he naive? Is he so full of himself that he's not thinking about how others are going to react? Listen to the word at the end of this dream. Vatishtachavena le'elumoti. And you were bowing down to my sheaf. What is this word? You might know in the Aleinu. What do we say in the Aleinu when we bow? V'anachnu korim u'mishtachavim. It's that same root. Vatishtachavena. It's a root that's usually used when we talk about bowing to God, bowing to Hashem. And that's what he says here. You are bowing low to me like I'm God.
Wow.
Big deal.
Yeah.
So what is it? Is Yosef just immature and self-centered and doesn't realize? Is he like a genius who is so smart that he just wants to share his wisdom, but he doesn't think about the impact of it? Because remember, ultimately, Joseph's dreams come true. And ultimately, when Joseph interprets dreams throughout the story, he's right. He interprets, he has a gift for prophecy. So he's not making it up that he's a great and wise and accomplished person. But does he really need to share that in this moment of all moments? Do you chalk it up to the fact that he's 17?
Yeah.
Can we give him a break here? Youthful inexperience? I see someone shaking a no. Sheila? I see some yes and some no.
Oh, I think he's inexperienced for sure.
Okay. So we could give him that benefit of the doubt. Anyone disagree?
he's
Anyone want him to
spoiled.
be wiser here?
He's full of himself. He doesn't stop and think about the consequences of the things that he's doing.
Yeah. And we all have been there in life we've all been so proud of our own accomplishments at times that we brag a little bit and don't think about how that bragging is making others feel. I've been there, certainly. And there's not an awareness that we want him to have. Rashi explains it very, very clearly here. No, it's Forno. It's an Italian commentator who says, this too was an ill-advised move. Had he been more mature, he would have kept the contents of such a dream to himself. And Sforno and other commentators too try to give him the benefit of the doubt and say, no, he's just a na'ar. He's still young. Don't put him up to that level that he will be later in life. For now, he's got some lessons to learn. And by the way, we're not going to get to the end of this chapter, the 37th chapter of Genesis. You should all look at it. But he learns the lessons in a big way. Where does Yosef end up as this chapter comes to its conclusion? Alone in a pit, waiting to be sold into slavery. When he arrives, he's thrown in jail. Not so great. And ultimately, we find that Yosef gains maturity. We're not going to get to the end of it in this class, but we find that he gains maturity the hard way. And that's how life works. We grow and we learn sometimes from messing up and from the challenges that result from those mistakes that we made. And when Yosef ends up in a pit and ends up in prison and all of the events that are going to unfold in this chapter, it's there that he grows into what we call in our tradition, Yosef HaTzadik, Joseph, the righteous person. Joseph, the one who was able to use his wisdom for the good rather than to make everyone around him feel bad. I see a hand from Sandy, and we're going to wrap up in the next few minutes because I have to run a little bit early today.
I just feel like if a parent is a child's first teacher, we're putting the blame on Yosef, but his father failed miserably.
Yeah. So I take that to heart, and I think a lot about Jacob as a character who makes incredible mistakes in the Torah. And this might be the biggest of them all, because it sets the stage ultimately for Jacob's suffering. What happens as a result of all this? Jacob and the brothers believe that Joseph is killed, and Jacob has to deal with the pain of believing that his favored son has died. And we see that in this parsha, mourning and sadness that result from that mistake that he made. So it's true that on some level, Jacob has to learn from this mistake and grow from it as well. It is a happy ending. There is a moment at the end of the story, which we'll get to in a few weeks, of reuniting and clearing of the air. But what it takes to get there is painful. And what it takes to get there is challenging. Challenging for Jacob, for the brothers in their guilt, because the brothers feel guilt, and for Yosef, who has to be in a pit and then in prison and deal with all of this stuff. So a lot of emotion going into this reading, a lot of backstory. I always think about the fact that Rachel passed away, and that what motivates Jacob in his favoritism is also his love for his wife who had died. And I try to soften it in that way. But there's a lot that goes into this story. Any other final thoughts or points? And then I want to share just one other idea with you for tonight. Anything I missed? Anything I didn't mention? Okay, good. So there's one character in this story that is strangely absent. And it's kind of a trick question. Who is the character that has figured prominently in every story in Genesis up until now and is absent from this story that we just started tonight? Probably the most important story in all of Bereshit. The most important character in all of Bereshit. Who's
God?
missing here?
God? Did they make any reference to Hashem?
Not that I saw.
Hmm.
God has been the focus of every story, speaking with the patriarchs in different ways, communicating with the patriarchs in different ways. The Joseph story is famous for God's absence. Throughout the story, we're waiting for God to intervene, to do something, to tell Jacob that he's doing it wrong, to help Joseph, to come and save the day, to tell the brothers not to harm Joseph. And yet, God is strangely absent. And this is one of those stories that reminds us that God works behind the scenes, that God often works behind the scenes in less explicit ways. Every step of the way, though Joseph's journey is fraught with problems and complications, he has faith that God will take him to a good conclusion, that everything will work out in the end. And in fact, it does. And in fact, it does. And it reminds me of why we study this story of Yosef on Hanukkah, because it's Hanukkah, the darkest and the coldest part of the entire year, when we're waiting for God to intervene in this miraculous way. And sometimes God does, and other times it's up to us to be the miracle and to be the ones who help each other when God feels absent. And so that's really my blessing and my takeaway for this evening, that my interpretation of the Hanukkah story isn't that the miracle was that the oil lasted for so long. It was that the Maccabees had the strength and the courage to believe in the possibility for a better future. And for us too, the miracle is not to wait and rely on God to come save the day always, but to be the ones who add that light to the world and who help to be the miracle for someone that's in need. So that's how I'll leave us tonight. I wish everybody a happy Hanukkah. Light that first light tomorrow night, and remember to let the light inspire you to do a mitzvah and to help lift up our world that's so very much in need. And I hope some of the lessons from the Yosef story will inform that and help you to work through that. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
A really good session. I'm going to post it on YouTube for all who need. And let me turn the recording off now. Bye, everybody.